Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is John McCarthy, and I'm with the Piedmont Environmental Council based in Warrenton, Virginia. PEC's work includes the protection of scenic and cultural resources in a 9-county area that's very rich in both, extending from Loudoun and Clark County in the north down what we call the morning side of the Blue Ridge down to Albemarle County. It's 9 counties, which has the complicated luck of being in the nexus geographically of a huge number of linear infrastructure networks involving energy and transportation. PEC has been forced over the years, and we have now been in existence for 49 years, to educate itself about federal and state energy and transportation policy in order to fulfill our mission within our communities. We work to engage, educate, and empower our citizens and to distill enormously complicated regulatory processes into relatable local impacts so that our communities can better respond to these outside impacts and forces. One of our engagements is with the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, which works to expand conservation efforts in the multi-state watershed of the Chesapeake Bay, including state governments, regional governments, non-governmental organizations, the National Park Service, and other federal agencies, tribal groups, all sorts of other organizations and groups to address in advance conservation in that watershed. My friend and colleague Jonathan Doherty will talk about some of the efforts of the Chesapeake Conservation Partnerships after I run you through a blistering series of slides about what PEC does on all these various conservation threats in our region. So, all right. All right, do you see my screen?
Yes, everything looks good.
Yes.
I'm already 100% better than I was in the previous presentation. So I want to talk in this session about how PEC, which is a small non-governmental organization, a private nonprofit organization of, I haven't checked this morning, but I think we're at 46 employees that are spread out over that 9-county region. But we're, again, 49 years old. We promote and protect the Piedmont's rural economy, natural resources, history, and beauty, and all in that all-encompassing phrase, quality of life. As conservationists, we work to protect people's rights to permanently preserve the ability to always have clean air and water, to live in well-planned communities, to benefit from sensible transportation policies, to draw from energy resources which do not threaten the landscape, to hold on to our historic heritage, to get healthy food from sound agricultural practices, and to enjoy a unique, unspoiled landscape. Here is a fairly recent map that's so small you're probably not going to get much out of it, but it's a listing of the conserved lands, protected lands in Virginia. And outlined there is the 9-county PEC region. So you'll see that there's quite a lot of them that are permanently conserved in Virginia that are in our region. We hope that we've been an important part of that. 427,000 acres, in fact, are preserved in the Virginia Piedmont region. This includes both publicly owned land like the Shenandoah National Park, which is a big part of that, but also privately conserved land, other state and federal lands as well. These are everything from conservation easements, publicly owned open space, existing historic districts, and a lot of other conservation resources beyond and including that 427,000. PEC works to develop the strongest case for conservation of these resources. We do this by bringing awareness to potential problems affecting our goals of conservation. Here's conservation. Here's an example: uranium in Virginia. Not currently legal to mine it, but seems like those of us who work in Virginia can attest to the fact that every couple of years there's another fight to allow uranium mining. But then there's also things like true linear infrastructure, like railroad expansions that are proposed, this between the community of Linden up near Route 66 and Culpeper, that's been talked about for a number of years. And by sometimes having to stand up to those challenges. So while we have to be aware of them, we sometimes also have to get into dogfights about them. PEC's approach starts with a regional structure, as I've said, 9 counties united under the same mission, but a local structure to direct the vision in the communities, because Albemarle County is not the same as Loudoun County, is not the same as Rappahannock County. We try to assess state and federal national capacity and try to be able to respond when there are proposals at those levels that sort of supersede our local regional area. We combine land conservation, land use, and other policy roles And probably most importantly, and what I'm trying to convey inexpertly in this presentation, is to engage citizens in land conservation and land use policies. PEC strategies are to promote smart growth. We believe in it, we foster it, and we are, in fact, stand up at hearings to promote transit-oriented development in Loudoun County. It sometimes blows people's minds when a conservation organization says that, but smart growth makes sense. We need to protect the country by saving the cities too. We respond to inappropriate development proposals and policies whenever that's appropriate. We promote an aggressive combination of public and private land conservation. That's been the subject of several presentations, both by me earlier today and by my colleague Kat Imhoff yesterday in partnership with Parker Agelesto from Richmond. We articulate an attractive and attainable vision for the future, and we relentlessly flog that to everybody who will listen. We impart this vision by facilitating communication between concerned citizens and decision makers. We do a great deal of convening. Protecting the conservation mission means knowing the legal environment, knowing what's going on out there and what might threaten us. But then secondarily, using the law as leverage when it provides us the tools to do so. For example, we found historic districts are very useful for land conservation, not because there's inherently anything in historic district legislation or enabling authority that says thou shalt not, but because once people are aware of a historic resource, they care about it. They work to defend it. Part of our region's success is talking about things like historic districts, the value of publicly protected lands. Again, you've seen this map earlier in this presentation, but it's worth reinforcing that one of the layers that comes into this map is historic districts, both conservation easements that exist in those districts, but also historic districts approved and proposed throughout our region. We identify important resources and use the right methods to protect them. Historic resources within the Piedmont is mapped here: Civil War battlefields, historic districts, and historic sites. We are also part of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area. This is something that people said, you're never going to get a regional compact, multi-states extending from Gettysburg to Monticello in the South because there's nothing that ties it together. Well, sure there is. There's the first 100 years of American history ties it together. A strategic approach to conservation in the large scale often manifests itself in the small scale. Here's a targeted outreach program we participated in to create a wildlife corridor linking the Shenandoah National Park, the Shenandoah River, and the George Washington National Forest. Not a whole lot of publicly owned land there, but there's some, but there's a lot of privately held land that committed to the effort because they basically recognized that this was an important wildlife corridor. Wildlife corridors exist, of course, throughout Virginia, and there's an increasing effort to try to build on that awareness and to make sure that conservation needs are met by establishing protections for those corridors. The conservation easements, again, are shown here. There's a strong correlation to wildlife habitat, but the corridors, of course, also connect wildlife from one part of the region to another. It is a land trust's obligation to articulate and defend the public values at risk. Here's natural resources within the Piedmont, scenic resources within the Piedmont, the rural economy, basically agricultural lands of prime or statewide significance, historic resources, whether they're Journey Through Hallowed Ground, proposed historic districts, historic sites, battlefields, other natural resources like important stands of timber. But you put those all together, you can create a compelling story about how important our conservation lands and our rural lands are. We coordinate with local governments on land conservation. We emphasize the importance of good land use policy. All of those two things together will best prepare for utility expansion and condemnation of lands. The linear infrastructure to serve the Northeast Corridor challenges us every day. We're talking a little bit now about the guidance and governance of different utility projects. I don't know where I came up with a steam train picture. I probably should have found a diesel one, but so it goes. Natural gas, we have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to deal with. Railway, we have the autonomous efforts of Surface Transportation Board, unless there's federal dollars involved, and there often aren't in the Virginia projects. In electrical transmission, you have both the state utility commissions and federal agencies. In highways, State Department of Transportation, as well as the Federal Highway Administration. We need always to understand the political environment and the fact that eminent domain is going to be used by either the state or federal governments, less often the local governments, to provide for the utility infrastructures of one sort or another that we need. Federal authorities are always going to override the state, who are always going to override the localities, but we need to understand the processes and the way we can fight them. We've owned property, for instance, here at Avoca, which is up in the northern part of Fauquier County, where our property was condemned for linear expansion. This is before natural gas pipeline and after was installed. Well, we worked pretty hard to mitigate that. Citing utility infrastructure and the conflicts of interest that inevitably come with this, utilities target open space by and large as ways to not interfere with built environment. Built environment costs money. People are problematic. They would try to avoid those places, even if to our eyes, those preserved open spaces are incredibly important. We end up battling over LULUs, the locally undesirable land uses, and the NIMBYs of not in my backyard. These are always going to erupt. No one wants to be in that house in front of those transmission lines. We have the priorities of conflicting utility companies. They want to get us fast from point A to point B in as little distance as they can. They don't want to get into condemnation of structures and human improvements, and they want to minimize their cost and their time. Our responsibility as conservationists, however, is to retain the integrity of terrain and soil, defend the habitats and biodiversity, protect water quality and supply, enrich recreational activities, enhance the experience of scenic viewsheds, and preserve the heritage. So we confront challenges and mitigate impacts. Electric transmission, for example. We have the misfortune, or I guess the virtues in some ways, of being in the national interest electric transmission corridor. The main one, there's certainly some in the West as well, but this one obviously deals with the enormous conurbation of megalopolis, which extends from Boston south all the way at least to Washington, D.C., but in most people's minds further south than that. The electric transmission corridor in this area is complex, numerous facilities and infrastructure planned. There's a critical congestion area that the northern part of our region falls squarely within, that area between Washington, D.C. and New York. Power plants emitting over 10 million tons of CO2 in 2005. And yes, that's gone down. It's going in the right direction, but we need to keep up the heat, metaphorically speaking, of course. There are lots of proposed transmission lines in this corridor. There are lots of existing transmission lines in this corridor, and the existing ones are looking to be upgraded, just as new ones are proposing to be built. All of these proposed challenges. Again, you see critical congestion areas of concern, and conditional congestion areas, which I've never figured out what that means, spread all across this country, but there's an enormous concentration of them here in the Northeast where we work. Here is proposed transmission lines in the Mid-Atlantic and the corridors that serve them. And the one that I'm going to talk a little bit about in detail is in the south there, circling through both Fauquier County, Warren County, and the northern part of Culpeper County, and also Rappahannock, I guess. This was a proposed 500 kV transmission line. It's actually it's a now in place 500 kV transmission line, I'm sorry to admit. But we had a lot of reasons to oppose it. The Department of Energy failed to consult states with the designation. They didn't consider alternatives, and they did not follow federal law. And we had to inform ourselves on all those various pieces of federal law to fight our way against this project. But we put together, and we're part of, I don't want to take too much credit, we were part of a broad coalition of a lot of organizations. Sierra Club, I won't list them all, but you can see them here on the slide. A very broad, diverse coalition of organizations trying to push back against the way the various PJM, which is the regulatory authority for electric transmission, and FERC for pipelines work in these areas. We had this battle on our home front. How do we put a 500 kV transmission line in an enormously rich environment of conserved landscapes and a lot of historic resources and conflict with those values? There were 37 historic sites on the state or national register, 12.9 miles of the Appalachian Trails. You can see Appalachian Trail. You can see all the rest. A huge amount of already designated conservation resources that were going to be impacted by this transmission line. There's a bunch of Civil War battlefields, enormously impactful on the experience for visitors of those sites and the historic integrity of those sites. So we tried to assess all the consequences. We looked at their preferred route. We looked at their alternative routes, and we looked at where their existing facilities were, mapped them, and shared them with communities. We compared them to where state scenic rivers was. We overlay that first. Then we overlay scenic byways, again, already listed scenic resources. Then we added birding and wildlife trails that were documented and established. Then we added the Appalachian Trail. Then we mapped the land visible from the Appalachian Trail to the visitor who's experiencing the trail. We then mapped historic districts approved and proposed. They were in the hopper towards getting approval at that point. Then map the Civil War battlefields, both the core battlefields and the undelineated battlefields, the areas that they hadn't been comprehensively studied yet, but were recognized as being within the battlefield area. We mapped all the historic sites, all the National Historic Landmarks. We added all the publicly owned open space, added all the existing approved agricultural and forestal districts, added all the conservation easements that had already been established. And suddenly the power line study area becomes very busy indeed. The strategy was to disprove claims of a fundamental need for the line, and that the line was not necessary for meeting the demands of public safety and public health. We proposed what most environmental organizations will propose, energy conservation as a better alternative. But we talked ultimately about the enormous impact on the visibility and the scenic resources of this transmission line. This shows where the transmission line would be visible from throughout the corridor. We proposed undergrounding for some sections of it. We didn't win, but we did propose that as an alternative for some of the most scenic, impactful stretches of the line. But that was a project that ultimately we didn't do very well on. We wish we would have been more successful, but we had to fight it because it mattered and there was a lot of values that were being compromised to do it. But we have a lot of other fights that are coming. There's backbone transmission projects beyond the next 5 years that are already listed in the various regulatory systems. I'm trying to think of the right word, potential targets. There's transmission projects beyond 5 years that they've already mapped. PJM is the regulatory authority that basically controls where electric transmission projects will be reviewed and approved. And there's obviously some deep impacts on our region by some of these projects. But that's not the only concern we have. It's not just electricity. There's also railway, I-81 Crescent Corridor. Norfolk Southern is a railway system that serves much of our region, almost the entirety of the eastern part of the United States. They have an existing system, but they have several proposed expansions that would be impactful of our region. I-81 has a corridor of rail service that goes to our west and would have some connections through our region into the east. PEC service area overlaps, and you can see there's a significant number of miles of their tracks that would be impacted, adding as many as 8 trains daily. So we end up talking about where railroads impact scenic resources, what scenic rivers, scenic roads are within X number of feet or miles of those rivers, of those rail lines, excuse me. The regulatory authority for rails is the Surface Transportation Board. It has some interstate commerce impacts. So another set of regulations we have to form ourselves on and be aware of in order to meet our local needs. We have a lot of land under permanent conservation easement, which doesn't mean it can't be condemned. It just means there's a separate process. And in Virginia, that's known as the Section 10.1 1704, typically abbreviated to the 1704 process. Oops. So when there's an attempt to condemn to make a new railroad line or a new connection or sidings, and there's a conservation easement, there's a process that has to be gone through to figure out whether that railway is going to prevail. Here's a railway expansion that would impact a county adjacent to us, but would require a connection through us. Projects involving federal funds do undergo a much more rigorous review. There's a process here put in place, which I won't go into detail, but we have to be aware of the opportunities to use the law to protect resources that are valuable in our communities. Prior to the approval of any license, as the case may be, for any federal funds to be expended on a project, the federal government has to take into account the effect of the project on any district, site, building, structure, or object included or eligible for inclusion in the National Register, generally referred to as the Section 106 project. Again, PEC's region is part of the National Heritage Area, the Journey Through Hollowed Ground. There's a lot of things that are going to be impacted by federal spending on the Journey Through Hollowed Ground. We've mapped all those things and overlaid them. Here's how the journey impacts existing historic resources and protected open space and how they jive together remarkably well, hence the designation by Congress to begin with in the Journey Through Hollowed Ground National Heritage Area. But one of those railroad projects would cut across both the Journey Through Hollowed Ground and connect 2 areas of it through Thoroughfare Gap. Obviously a big concern to us in the northern part of our region, but another railroad expansion has been proposed down near Montpelier in Orange County in the southern part of our region. So it's not like we have one spot we have to worry about. There's lots of places to worry about. And there's a strong correlation, obviously, between existing railheads and transit points and historic resources in Virginia, because obviously a lot of those downtown old train train stations are now in historic districts. They also, of course, were fought over extensively during the Civil War, so there's a strong battlefield correlation with where rail lines are in Virginia. So the Rail Enhancement Fund, Department of Rail and Public Transit, has to be assessed when they are spending money to improve the rail system in Virginia. And we fight with them, not as often because there's not that much project, but the projects that do happen, we got to fight with them. And it's important to understand those levers and tools of the government. More than anything else, what we try to drive in these discussions and considerations is that local governments get engaged and get involved. They have opportunity through their comprehensive plans and their local zoning and regulatory structure to minimize the impacts of some of these proposed projects, which we can envision on the horizon, both their environmental impact and their impact on open space in those local communities. PEC actively, in the case of these rail and public transit discussions, PEC held meetings in almost every county affected by proposed rail expansion. Several of our counties don't have any railroads, and a couple of them, the railroads and lines in their communities didn't have any proposed improvements. But the ones that did, we invited local officials and landowners on the line to come in with questions. We did our best to answer them, and we documented them. In the case of Orange County, again, in the southern part of our region, we mapped all the resources that might be impacted by the rail expansion and provided it to the local governments so they could consider them in a deliberative fashion. We talked about proposed railroad expansions in the north of our region, in an area around Delaplane, which is in Fauquier and near the border of Loudoun counties. Here would be an enormous impact on a lot of existing conservation easements. The point of all this is to create a picture that people relate to. Huge federal regulatory structures and processes are intimidating. They're scary. They're complicated. They have a lot of bells and whistles, but no real easy access points. So our job, we feel, is to provide those point of access for local communities, to be able to go to a Culpeper, a Bealton, an Orange, a Charlottesville, as shown on this map, and talk about what expansion in that particular corridor would impact and how it would affect you and your community. Natural gas is much the same way. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates natural gas, and they are involved in all decisions about siting and abandonment of facilities, whether it's pipelines, storage, or liquefied gas of any sort. It's complicated. Natural gas runs all over this country. There are interstate pipelines and intrastate pipelines, and a couple of them run right through Virginia. And obviously, with the Mountain Valley Pipeline and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline controversies over the last few years, it's been a very on-point topic in Virginia. FERC does consider environmental assessments or environmental impact stations or historic preservation reviews, and we are usually out there pushing them to give the higher level of analysis than whatever level of analysis they feel is called for, since we feel it's generally more than they're willing to. Natural gas supply basins relative to major natural gas pipeline transportation corridors matter. We have to know where the gas is in order to speak knowledgeably about where it's reasonable to have transportation corridors to get it to where it's needed. So we spend a lot of time educating ourselves on natural gas markets, hubs, corridors, basins, and the flows and how they go over the course of a year. We have major gas pipelines. And as I said early in the presentation, we've been the unfortunate beneficiary of a condemnation action on a property that we owned in northern Fauquier County, Avoca, which was under conservation easement, but the FERC authorized the condemnation, but we negotiated extensively with the natural gas company to try to minimize the impact and mitigate it. Here's a generalized aerial view of the property. Here's some mapping of fencing and restrictions that existed on the property and where building would be allowed. That's in the purple colored places where we could actually build something and everything else was kept free. So we negotiated with Columbia Gas to minimize the disturbance of conservation values. We basically required everything be buried within a net with existing rights of way, try to minimize the amount of clearance that would take place, all consistent with right of way narrow enough to allow them to do what they needed to do, but would not otherwise compromise what we were trying to do. No above ground structures would be authorized, which would scar the viewshed from the Appalachian Trail and from the Shenandoah Valley. So here's a view from Ashby Gap looking down on Avoca. So you can see that once everything grows back, shouldn't be too noticeable. We emphasize the need for design and construction to minimize the impact for all those values. And we push for that in other places. And the one thing we'd probably do over again if we had the opportunity was work more closely with the Sky Meadows State Park or in the National Park for the Appalachian Trail folks to make sure there would be other values protected, views from other places. let's talk about where we all want to go. I think we all want to go in the future, which is renewable energy, and how there are lots of different factors that come into play on that. Virginia, for good or ill, at least our part of Virginia, doesn't have much potential for wind power development. So we're not probably going to be seeing a whole lot of wind turbines erected in our part of the state, but the transmission of the power generated by other places might very well come through us. So we have to be aware of where wind is generated and where it might be sent to provide service. So we have to think very carefully, look forward, and consider the positions we're going to take where we're looking at where existing transmission lines are and where they might need to be built to harness that power. In Virginia's case, we're about to embark on a period of accelerated renewable energy development. Solar energy is likely to be the thing that impacts us most directly in terms of impacts on our large landscape. We're going to get a lot of solar built in our part of Virginia, dramatic increases in megawatt hours and capacity. This is a measurement of DEQ notices of intent versus the PJM generation queue. That's the projects they are in line to measure, assess, and authorize. So here's a map of renewable energy projects, solar, wind spread out all around the state. Again, a whole lot more concentrated in the southern and eastern part of the state than there are in our region, but there's more coming. DEQ has issued 26 permits for solar project with an additional 58. I'm sorry, that's a year and a half old at this point, so there's more than that. But DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, is issuing a lot of permits and notices of intent. What's generating all this heat for solar? It's reduction in costs. It's scale, demand from corporate users seeking renewables. You know, everyone points to Loudoun County's enormous growth of server farms. It's now the biggest server farm in America. The number of enormous facilities there is composed of a lot of corporate users that want renewable energy, want to be able to claim they're buying renewable energy. And so there's a lot of demand for wind and solar in Virginia to service that corporate desire, but also the fact that it's a lot more efficient to do, or becoming more efficient to do. There's also fiber optic networks and electric transmission lines in this corridor. And if you could access those fiber optic lines, and because of all those data servers up in Loudoun, you're also looking at the electric transmission corridors you can hook into if you're generating power from solar farms. Utility scale solar needs 7 to 10 acres to generate 1 megawatt, and the vast majority of megawatt generated from projected solar energy will be utility scale solar. Will not be rooftops. It'll be these sorts of things. 5,000 megawatts has been deemed to be in the public interest by Virginia, which might take as many as 50,000 acres. Also, some natural gas peaking plants, 8 new facilities over the next 8 to 10 years. We'll see if that doesn't change as demand for gas goes down. Here's an example, 1,400 acres under panel in Southampton. 1% of the agricultural land in the county is taken up by this project. That's not insignificant. I'm sorry, 1,288 acres under panels. We've looked at our neighbor over in the Shenandoah Valley. This is the solar panel project over in Luray. Obviously enormously impactful because a lot of that is in the viewshed of the Shenandoah National Park and the Skyline Drive. Here's S-Power Solar, thus far the biggest project in Virginia, 6,500 acres in Spotsylvania County. Enormously impactful on viewsheds because it's very near both the Chancellorsville and Wilderness battlefields. Utility solar siting principles that we try to project into our communities and encourage local governments to consider is avoid, co-locate, mitigate, and restore. We think there's a lot more potential for rooftop solar. Yes, it's not as economical, but it's certainly a whole lot of relic brown fields, gray fields, and parking lots that could have distributed solar facilities placed on top of them, and it doesn't result in green fields being lost. Here's a project that we actually ended up supporting because they agreed to some site mitigation impacts that we thought were important. 20 megawatt facility, 196 acres under panels, located in Remington in Fauquier County. So we think that scale, impacts to conservation values, conservation practices, interconnection, and decommissioning plans have to be in place for utility scale solar. We've talked this through with many of our local governments, and many of them have adopted ordinances which at least refer to these concerns. Sometimes they don't always follow them. Utility scale solar projects can be awfully lucrative for local governments, and so they're often pursued. We've fought back one project because it was enormously impactful on historic resources and existing conservation lands in Culpeper County called Cricket Solar, which the Board of Supervisors turned down, but there will be other versions following in its wake. We particularly like to point out prime ag soils. In the wake of the pandemic, if there's not a point in which America, and Virginia in particular, realizes that having the ability to grow its own food is important, it was recently. Cricket Solar had a lot of impact on other resources, flood zones. It was going to build panels literally in floodplain, which didn't make any sense to us, and we pointed it out. So the challenges are going to continue to develop. There's going to be all different forms of them. I-81 proposed new I-83 corridor. We have to be aware of these sorts of projects, even if increasingly these sorts of enormous infrastructure projects don't seem all that likely. But as soon as I say infrastructure projects don't seem likely, the federal government has a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure proposal on the drawing boards, which I think might make some of these impossibles possible. And so we'll have to be aware of them. We need to be serious about the mission of land conservation and scenic preservation. It's something that all of us need to spend a lot of time and effort on. We need to understand and defend the value of easement language when we're trying to protect scenic resources. We need to be familiar with state conservation easement laws. We need to advocate for the public acquisition of easements, but certainly there needs to be the preservation of private easements. We work to keep people informed and to get citizens involved in these enormously complicated federal and state regulatory processes so that they can be stewards of the environment as we try to help them be. We provide the tools to inform citizens and property owners about what is going on, but help them to make smart local decisions, both for unbuilt, built, and future building so that they can be aware of it. We want them to be aware of what's in their backyards. We want them to be aware of what's already been approved and what that might mean for the future. We want them more than anything else to take part in local government. We believe in educate and empowering people. We want them to have an opportunity to say what they want to have happen. Our role is to, exactly what our mission statement says, to promote and protect Virginia Piedmont's rural economy, natural resources, history, and beauty. But we want partners to do that. And one of the things we push for is that communities engage in these decisions and not just leave it to us eggheads, but actually involve themselves. And with that, I'm going to conclude my talk and turn it over to my friend Jonathan Doherty to talk about one of those partners we work a lot with, the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership.
Thank you, John. Just 1 second here. So I'm gonna, I guess maybe zoom out a little bit to a different altitude. John has been talking about just how some of this plays out on the ground, and I want to look at it from a bigger perspective, or a watershed-wide perspective, and what we can do to address some of the tools that can help us do this kind of work. And first, as John noted earlier, the partnership is a coalition of dozens of agencies and organizations around the Chesapeake watershed that are working to conserve culturally and ecologically important landscapes for multiple values, multiple benefits. And for those of you who may not be in the watershed, it's a big place, 64,000 square miles from central New York to Norfolk, Virginia, and from West Virginia to Delaware. I just want to take you on a quick little tour through this because it's really about landscapes and the way that people perceive them, which is the scenic values that they see, whether it's an Otsego Lake at the headwaters of the Chesapeake watershed, the Chemung River Valley of New York, the Susquehanna as it flows through Pennsylvania, the North Branch or the West Branch in the Pennsylvania wilds, one of the most wild areas of the northeastern United States. The rural agricultural lands. I mean, these are places where people care about views, about character, about scenery, about history. Battlefields that are hallowed ground. Down to the Chesapeake itself in Maryland, even urban iconic landscapes where, we have similar issues. West Virginia, Shenandoah Valley that we saw earlier, the Rapidan headwaters within the Piedmont range, I believe, the Upper Rappahannock, Piedmont itself, down to the tidal segments of Virginia along the Rappahannock, or in Maryland on the eastern shore. You know, it's not that there isn't infrastructure in there. In some cases, that infrastructure has become iconic in itself, like the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland has some of that sense that has developed over time. And the same is true about some of the historic infrastructure that you find in places like Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And you know, as John mentioned, there are places that are developed from, you know, the Elizabeth River to Baltimore and the like. And so John showed a series of maps in the Piedmont that kind of teed up a series of things. And at the watershed-wide scale, the partnership has looked at a series of goals organized around farms, forests, habitat, heritage, and health that in total are, you know, essential to creating and maintaining quality of life. I'm just going to focus in on one of them today, the heritage piece that speaks to the kind of the visual and historic side of these places, protecting these landscapes along designated trails, scenic rivers, byways, parks. You can read them. I'll come back to the map of this in just a moment, but that's really the resource base, if you will. And it's all of those kinds of things that John was just talking about that has the ability to impact it in different ways, you know, each of which could be done in a certain location without an adverse effect, but depending on where they're located, it could be more or less a problem. And to cite one specific example, picture yourself as the person standing behind the camera, and you're looking out the James River. You're standing in a national historical park. The land a little bit on the horizon, just beyond the sign on the right, is Jamestown Island, and the first site of the first permanent English settlement in North America. And it's a stretch of river that's uncrossed for 55 miles. And that is the location of a transmission line that was proposed in sight of a National Historical Park, Jamestown Island, the Colonial Parkway, which was designed to have the feel of an untrammeled rural landscape, a National Historic Landmark at Carter's Grove, and crossing a congressionally designated National Historic Trail, which is essentially the river itself. And the proposal for this created a massive public involvement campaign at the national and the regional level, with the National Parks Conservation Association, the National Trust, Historic Preservation Virginia, and many others involved. You know, pretty strong statements from high levels of the federal government, including the Director of the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior. You know, this is unsuitable at this location. And yet the Army Corps of Engineers in 2017, after a multi-year battle, issued a finding of no significant impact. Think about that. There wasn't even an environmental impact statement prepared. And once that permit was issued, that was built in view of a National Historic Landmark, a National Historical Park, and crossing a National Historic Trail, literally. So if you're moving up the trail in a boat, you're going right under that in a formerly undeveloped area. So what happens 2 years later? the United States Court of Appeals, after it's built, reverses the permit, reverses the court's a lower court's decision, and instructed that the permit be vacated and that an environmental impact statement be prepared. That's not the way things should work. And the Corps issued an after-the-fact EIS in November, and the battle is still on. The National Parks Conservation Association is demanding that a supplemental DEIS be prepared because alternatives weren't adequately considered. We'll see where it goes, but one of the lessons that came out of that is, much the way John was talking about, we can either be prepared to deal with these things or unprepared. And particularly, there's a sense of this approach to mitigation is being arbitrary and opaque and reactive and confusing. Frankly, the number of conversations that had to be held between the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers just to get them to appreciate some of these values was just astonishing. And the recognition that the mitigation hierarchy of avoid first, minimize if you can't avoid, and offset what you can't minimize or avoid was largely ignored. Those principles that come out of work by the Nature Conservancy and others, where you truly evaluate the impacts of different alternatives, understand what they are, work to avoid them, and then move down the scale as necessary. But when you get into mitigation, you strive to do something positive in the end. That didn't happen there. And I'll come back to it in a minute because there was a sizable mitigation agreement associated with the Surrey Skiffs project on the James River. So that was a learning experience for many. And the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership began to think about, it's a regional coalition. What are the things that can be done to be better positioned for this work? And it falls out in these four categories. Clearly documenting resources, thinking about the policy changes that might need to be made, doing a better job about methodologies associated with assessment, particularly when it relates to scenic resources and historic also. And then make sure some of the information about what's really important is out there in advance rather than after the fact. So I'll just stop through a couple of these, and most of this is just to give you a sense of what's being done with one particular assessment methodology. So just in contrast to the documentation that John described earlier in the Piedmont that's robust, that is not the case. When we look at this watershed-wide map of heritage resources, it looks impressive, and it was pulled together. It was the first time this information was ever pulled together on a watershed-wide scale a couple of years ago. But all of these individual units, including state scenic byways, state scenic rivers, have viewshed analyses been done of those? No. And so none of that is documented. And thus it's harder to be prepared for and advise proponents of projects what to avoid beforehand. And it's also important to note that our documentation has been biased over time. There are resources that we have not sought to document adequately. And so the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation partners in the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership launched a major effort to begin documenting African-American historic sites, for example, which have far too long been ignored. So those things aren't even in the mix for the consideration in many cases. In terms of policy changes, the partnership contracted with the Environmental Law Institute to develop an assessment of opportunities to improve landscape scale mitigation, which has a host of 14 different recommendations. The report's available on the partnership's website, and happy to send it to anyone who's interested. But one of those recommendations, about halfway down, or 2/3 of the way down, advancing the protection of historic, cultural, and scenic resources, thought, well, is there a piece that we can pick off to address here? And that's in the context of assessment methodologies. Because one of the things that, I mean, it's no surprise to anyone, but was so evident in the Surrey Skiffs project, is just, the Corps was largely dismissive of it. And there was not a clear methodology, not a way of quantifying impacts. And so effectively they weren't considered. And so the partnership in association with the Chesapeake Bay Trust and the Chesapeake Bay Program worked to stand up a scenic landscape impact assessment methodology initiative to see if we could create a method that could put visual resources and impacts on par with other factors, be adaptable, be manageable, and quantify results in a way that they could be used in mitigation and compensation. And T.J. Boyle and Associates, Jim Palmer, who some of you know is a national expert, has really been the lead on this. I'm just a mouthpiece in this presentation, and the technical details are being laid out in papers being published in professional journals and the like. The project's been advised by an advisory group of folks who either really kind of know this work or really care about it, including John and others, including I think Mark was on the call earlier. So the idea is to develop a GIS-based model that would create metrics to describe visual change in scenic quality, and apply it in a couple of case studies. So I'm going to just walk through these really quickly, not to get into details, but to give some sense of how the approach is developing. So one of the case studies was a wind case in the southern tier of New York. We actually used existing built projects because of the data that was available for them. There's a whole series of wind turbines through a largely rural, agricultural and forested landscape in these locations. And, the factors in terms of scenic impacts really amount to the amount of the visual exposure, is it just the end, or the full sweep of a tower in this case, and how far away you are from this, because the farther you are away, the less prominent it is. So, in how the topography impacts that more. So here's an example of the analysis that was done for just one turbine that illustrates that the darker the colors, the more of the turbine you're seeing, the redder the color, the more in the foreground. So the highest impact area is the bullseye in the middle, as you can see. In a lot of places, it's not visible at all. And that impact tends to change depending on how far you are away and the different ratings. So could actually, through this model, understand the prominence, the visual prominence of individual turbines. And you can see that some are a lot less prominent than others, which points to the fact that there could be some flexibility in how these things are cited. and that could be driven by a GIS-based quantitative analysis. And it could also begin to look at, here's two different scenarios of kind of clustering these into two different projects. What if you took project A and project B and compared those as alternatives and generate a series of adjusted visual impact data that you could then look at on a scale of impact from, you know, the trivial to very large. So it's adding a quantitative approach to doing that. So after that, we took another look at a solar case study. John mentioned some, you know, how prevalent that is, and it's something we want to encourage, but in the right places. And in this case, part of it was to test out, well, what happens when you factor in scenic resources into this as a layer or a factor. So there are a series of those that were mapped based on existing data in this particular location. And you have a couple of existing, or 3 existing solar panels that were used as the test case. And you know, rather than individual turbines, you're sampling a series of points along those to make it manageable. It's again, you know, a question of proximity, distance zones that's relevant here, just as it was in the other, and you can weight those differently. And then I couldn't articulate how it works, but the diagram at the top of the next couple of slides is essentially the ArcGIS model that's used for looking at and calculating the view shed, the cumulative view sheds, the weighted view sheds, looking at where the highest impact is on a solar panel. So this is comparable to the wind turbine view earlier, is that, you know, the more purple the color, the less prominent, the yellower, the more. And so there are different values even within the space of that fine grain. So it suggests that sighting again and screening is critical and can allow you to look at different alternatives. And you can begin to look at what the cumulative impact is of these particular panels, which is not particularly great. The red are the panels themselves. So you can see there's not a whole lot. So this is not a bad case application. You know, just based on the colors themselves. And you can see even that in this case, the scenic resources that were impacted, well, many of them were not impacted, and some of them only at a very small level. So this is creating that ability to do these things. GIS-based model that's adaptable for different kinds of projects, and that can quantify visual change. So the next steps on this, I mean, this is a very current active thing, is to actually transfer this to a targeted group of GIS practitioners who are doing this work. I'm certain one of them will be at the Piedmont Environmental Council, who can then deploy this methodology in you know, specific real-time projects that are being planned or proposed, so that it can be used for influencing things in advance rather than just after the fact case studies like we've done today. And then that this can be, you know, disseminated, can support additional training, and then actually use it for developing policy applications. You know, what if a state regulatory agency adopted the quantitative methodology that's included in here as a requirement for permits and the like? That's not impossible. So just going back, you know, here to Surrey skiffs for a moment. there was over an $85 million mitigation package that came along with this project. That's a big chunk of cash. And it went to a variety of good projects, including land conservation, some restoration projects, and the like. But that was based on an environmental assessment and a finding of no significant impact that made no effort to avoid impact and never fully calculated anticipated impacts in the context of a National Historical Park and a National Historic Landmark. So do we have any basis there for saying whether the impacts were adequately offset or not? No, we don't. We know they weren't. And so part of this effort, or driver of this effort, is to begin to quantify and regularize the inclusion of these values into systems that continue. So it takes back to, this is just one piece. It takes all four of these bins here and influencing things and providing guidance, to avoid these things in the future. I just want to cite one example. It goes to one of the things John was talking about in terms of solar development. In Maryland has a goal of getting to 50% renewable by 2030. 14% of that, or 14.5% of that, needs to be from solar. So where does that go? Well, the Conservation Innovation Center at the Chesapeake Conservancy has conducted a couple of county analyses of how to site that in optimal locations, publicly owned lands that, I'm forgetting the specifics of that, degraded lands, total rooftop, brownfields, and the like. Right? And in St. Mary's County, they did this in Baltimore County as well, but in St. Mary's County, they calculated that there were 4,400 acres of that optimal space, not farmlands, not forest land, but effectively dedicated space. And then analyzed that if just 8% of the optimal sites were viable, the 14.5% goal would be met. I mean, that says it all. So avoidance methodologies for making sure that happens, doing these kinds of planning calculations is critical. It's all in there.
Good Lord, Jonathan, your timing's amazing.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Our session is supposed to be over now, but if there are people who want to stay and ask a few questions, I'm hoping both of you won't mind staying a couple minutes.
Sure.
And we can do that. And as I said, we have a small enough group. If anybody wants to turn on their mic, turn off their mute, will be welcome to do that, or we can use the chat box. Otherwise, we have there's a live demo of Terrain 360, which provides panoramic images that will be in the Rivanna room if anyone is interested in looking at that. And this is a long break, so we don't come back until 2:25.